What's happening? What's happening? What's happening, blues people? Happy Father's Day. I repeat, happy Father's Day. This is Sunday, June 15, 2025. We are alive. We are breathing. There is turmoil in the world, but there is also camaraderie, love, togetherness, and all the, I guess, positive attributes of communal engagement and family engagement, right? And tribe engagement. But there's also the blues. Now, those of you who rock with me know every Sunday I go live with a live broadcast from Jack Dappa Blues Radio right here, and we discuss blues as music, blues as ecology, blues as a narrative, blues as culture, and everything that has to do with it, soundscape, landscape, and all the good stuff. Tonight is not going to be a live broadcast, but I got something for you. You will be hearing first and foremost right here premiering one of the most significant interviews that I feel I've conducted with Dr. Hazzard-Donald, the writer of Jookin and the writer of Mojo. Okay, and she's going to go into her studies, into her practices, into her scholarship, and how hoodoo and blues live together and where they come from, and how it plays out in the South, Black South, and then spreads out the whole gambit, you know. So just sit back, listen, take notes if you want, find a book, read it. I'll be back at you all next week with a live broadcast. However, I got some news. Remember, you can always, let me get this up here so y'all can see. For us to do this, there is overhead, right? So you can always donate to Cash App, Venmo, as well as PayPal. Okay, Cash App, Venmo, as well as PayPal. You can always donate. You can also become a Patreon member. Let's see, where's this Patreon at? Oh, here we go. You could become a Patreon member right here. You get good benefits. I'm going to adjust some. So if you want to get on it right now, you should. You will get the adjustment updates this week, because this week I will be premiering, well, it's not really a premiere, but the next episode of the Jack Dappa Blues Reflexive podcast will be going on this week. And I got a couple of surprises for you. You know what? The next surprise will come Patreon first. Second, it'll come here. So sit back, enjoy this interview. Please, everything is about edification. Everything is about learning, engagement, communication, and it's reciprocal. You know to find me, how to contact me if you have any questions about this stuff. If there's a topic that you would like me to discuss. Remember, we're still celebrating Black Music Month, Music History Month. You can go back and look at our last couple of broadcasts that discuss Black Music History Month, which is June, okay? And then you can go back and find out about Phil Hollers, slave seculars, whatever. It's all right here, okay? And am I forgetting something? That's right. The new issue is out, the African American folklorist. All right, get in contact with me for your copy. If you want to buy it in bundles, definitely get in contact with me. Our updated and new website is live. Go check it out, subscribe, be part of it, get active. All right, I'm being okay. Folks is hitting me up. That means it's time. All right. I'll see y'all later. All right, so sit back and enjoy this really significant interview with the brilliant Dr. Katrina Hazzard-Donald. Thank you. What's happening? What's happening? What's happening, blues people? I'm really excited for my guest today, because we from Mississippi Delta crossroads to Carolinas, the root gardens from the jook joints to front porch remedies, there is a world of sound, spirit, and story beneath, within, engulfed, even glazed in the blues. Y'all know this is Jack Dappa Blues, but that I'm not important, and the name of the show is not important. What's important is today's guest. I would say the nation's leading dance researcher and pioneering scholar of African American culture, folklore, folk belief, folk life, Dr. Katrina Hazzard-Donald, author, lecturer, and professor emerita at Rutgers University. Right? Dr. Hazzard-Donald has written extensively of African American dance, folk belief, and spirituality. Her books include the award-winning Jookin, The Rise of Social Dance Formations in African American Culture, and what we're going to focus a lot more today on, Mojo Workin, The Old African American Hoodoo System, which presents a groundbreaking theory of the ring shout and documents her first-hand work with hoodoo practitioners. As an initiate in the Yoruba tradition, a former civil rights worker in Mississippi, and a scholar with fellowships from the ACLS and Rockefeller Foundation, Dr. Hazzard blends academic rigor with lived experience. She's been a voice in Emmy-winning documentaries, curated major exhibits, and recently challenged emerging scholars to rethink dance research as full cultural immersion. Today we explore her work. I don't know if we have enough time to explore her life's work in this one episode. Conjure, juke joint, sacred rhythm, and the blues people's sacred roots. Dr. Hazzard, how are you?
Good, good. Thank you. And how are you?
I'm well. I need to get a applause sound. So because you deserve an applause right there.
Thank you.
So now I want to start from kind of sort of the beginning, right? So first let me show the folks. This is the one of the books that we're going to be talking about today. And for those of you who follow this show and my work, that book is mentioned often. The writer is sitting with me, and I would like to ask you, Dr. Hazzard, what inspired, what conjured the book?
Well, well, I don't know. I started looking at the internet one day and came across a couple of websites that spoke about hoodoo. And as I went through the websites, I noticed that there were things that were drastically different than the hoodoo that I had grown up with in my household. And as I continued to read through this material, it dawned on me that here was someone who was basically an outsider to the tradition, who was taking the tradition in a sort of distorted way and selling it back to us. And, as a person who was familiar firsthand with some of the practices, I could see lots of errors and lots of what I consider mistakes. And people were sort of being led down a commercial road. And there was this other system that was operating underground that apparently lots of people didn't know about. And so I just became inspired to write a piece to challenge that. Let me use that term.
I like that term. So okay, we're going to dive into that. Now I want to start. The next question goes to the hoodoo you grew up with, right?
Yeah.
So you're obviously coming from a first person a narrative. Talk to us about the upbringing and your connection.
Well, my family's from Alabama, and I was the first generation not born in the Black Belt. But when people left the South, they brought the South with them. So I grew up in a household where I heard lots of talk about hoodoo and mojos. And my mother, she would was accused of having 6 breasts instead of 2 because she had so many high John the Conqueror roots pinned inside of her blouse.
Wow.
Of course, my dad, who was my maternal grandfather, who legally adopted me, often spoke of hoodoo. I grew up hearing stories of how hoodoo had gotten him out of jail and got him off of 5 charges. And I just heard just all kinds of things in my family. And I'd see people do all kinds of things like spread salt around the house. Oh my goodness. My great grandfather's sister would come from Alabama, would come up from Montgomery. And whenever she came north, she stayed at my grandmother's house where I was also living and had lived my entire life. And I had no idea why she would send me out in the field in the vacant lots around the neighborhood to pull up certain weeds for her. I had no idea with these people coming to the house to talk to Aunt New that she was actually a root worker.
Mm-hmm.
And so hearing these stories and seeing my mom and my grandfather and people do this kind of stuff was just so commonplace. I never paid a lot of attention to it. And I didn't realize that it would be so useful later on in life. And so I started just rethinking what I was seeing online. And then I started coming across these egregious errors. For example, on a site called luckymojo.com, I would see the proprietor speaking of something that she called a nation sack. And I thought, my goodness, what could this thing be, this nation sack? That didn't make sense to me. And as I searched through the literature, just reading folklore studies, I noticed that there were frequent errors. Let me give you another example. And I'm going to relate this example back to that first one I just mentioned about nation sack. Excuse me, I have terrible hay fever and the air is full of pollen here in Philadelphia. Excuse me if I'm coughing. I read a manuscript in the American Journal of Folklore written by a woman who had previously owned slaves. And she was describing, in this article, she described a children's game that slave children used to play in the front yard. And during this game, the children would get an old brush broom, which was just a piece of bushes that people would use as a broom. And they were tying this thing around their waist and letting it hang off their butts as if it were a tail. And they were literally dragging that tail behind them while they were saying what this person repeated. The kids were singing Mr. Cooler, Mr. Cooler, Cooler. And that didn't rub me right. I said, that's awfully strange that slave children would be pronouncing the final consonant. Right. I have a PhD from Cornell, and I don't even pronounce my final consonants. We don't pronounce our final consonants when we're in everyday conversation with Black folks. I would never have said Mr. Cooler. I would have said Mr. Cooler, if anything. So something said to me, try to say that word as Papa, your great granddaddy, who didn't die until I was 17, so I knew him most of my young life. Say that term as Papa would say it. And I just began to repeat it over and over again, trying to get into my great-grandfather's accent. Mr. Cooler, Mr. Cooler. Oh, then it dawned on me. The children were playing Mr. Cooter. Mm-hmm. The white woman, this folklorist or whoever she was correcting their English. So everybody knows that gator drags his tail in the water. Cooter drags his tail in the sand. Gator drags his tail in the water. When the mighty wolf starts to dragging his tail, he done stole somebody's daughter. Now that's a line out of a Howlin' Wolf blues song. Those kids were dragging their tail. They were playing Mr. Cooter, and everybody knows that Cooter drags his tail in the sand. And that's what they were doing. That's when it hit me. Go back and look at this nation sack and say it as your great-granddaddy would have said it. Nation, that's when it dawned on me. She was talking about the old hoodoo nature sack, which is a type of mojo that has to be wrapped during coitus. You have to wrap it while you are having sex. And women use it to control their man's virility. They use it to control their men's sexuality so that their man cannot get an erection if he's with another woman. It's called nature sack because we refer to sex as nature. I heard the old ladies talking about men in the neighborhood when I was growing up, and they'd say, oh, child, that man ain't got no nature. That means that he couldn't get an erection. Nature sack. And she was calling it a nation sack And she said that it was only wrapped in Memphis, Tennessee, which of course made no sense to me. And everybody knows that Memphis is that first city, big city you hit as you're leaving the Delta on Highway 61.
That's
Okay?
right.
That's when it dawned on me. She's correcting Black folks' English. We
Again,
weren't saying nation sack. And why would, is there somebody at the border of Memphis stopping people and searching them saying, you got your nation sack on you? You can't let that nation sack leave the city of Memphis. It made absolutely no sense to me at all. And so something said, a higher power wrote that book, by the way. I didn't write it. This higher power said, sit your butt down and write this thing.
mm-hmm.
Sat down and began to write it. And I would literally have to wait for the spirit to download before I could put a word on the page. I couldn't write it. I was paralyzed. And I'd pray and I'd wait, and boom, the chapter would come to me. And sometimes
Mm-hmm.
I'd sit down, I wouldn't take a breath until I'd done 12 or 15 pages. And I've never been able to do that.
So the ancestors were guiding you on this mission.
I believe so.
I want to. There's so many things I want to talk to you about, but there's one particular because it has a lot to do with everything. Which is why I'm just nothing is by chance. And when I hung up the phone with you, I said nothing is by chance in our world. Black vernacular versus Western vernacular, and the idea of allegedly correcting our speech seems to be a thing. Could you walk us through how that either affects or disconnects us from our root source, if that makes any sense?
Yeah. Well, I saw it firsthand when I looked at Mr. Cooler.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the title of this article, Mr. Cooler, a slave children's game. Correcting our English. I think this is the same thing that happens with the concept of jook. Zora Neale Hurston calls it the Jook. We call it the Juke, because that's the proper way, the standard English way. And that's what we heard white people saying. And of course, they're always correct. And we were trying to talk proper, and we called it a juke joint instead of the old juke house, which is what my grandfather would have called it, or our great grandparents would have called it. And it literally disconnects us from our tradition because we accept this word of these outsiders who are scholars oftentimes, and we think that they're correct rather than looking inward, listen to what your grandmother said. How would she have pronounced that? How would my grandmother from Montgomery or my mother from Mobile have said that? And I just began to go back into who I am and who our people are. The reason that the so-called dialect poets like Paul Laurence Dunbar wrote in Black vernacular is because they were not ashamed of who we are. The way we speak to each other is just as valid as the way anybody else on this planet speaks. And so when we correct ourselves, we are disconnecting. We have to be code switchers in this world. We have to be able to speak to our people, ourselves, and we have to be able to speak to the outside world as well. And we have to know the difference.
Can I use that as a basis for the African American folklorist? You know what? I do want to. So in your work and your bio, you're considered a trailblazing sociologist, folklorist. I would imagine theologian, right? What do all these things intersect? Break that down for us. Where do you find yourself? Are you a folklorist? Are you do you teach what is it called? I can't think. Religious studies. That's not the term I was looking for. I can't remember. What is your discipline?
Well, I was trained as a sociologist at Cornell.
Okay.
But I was unusual because I was not a numbers cruncher, and I had a minor area in dance, drama, and theater history.
Mm-hmm.
I also had a second minor area in European intellectual history because I felt that I had to master that as well. And so I was just trained in mainstream sociology. with the minor area in dance, drama, and theater history, and European intellectual history, which of course is the foundation of sociology. It comes out of that European intellectual tradition. And so that was my training. When I got the job at Rutgers, I was hired on the straight race and ethnicity line, and I taught a wide range of courses. And then I created, I don't know, maybe 13, 14 courses for Rutgers. They didn't have a Du Bois seminar, so I created a Du Bois seminar. I taught race and ethnicity, which was not being taught in the curriculum, and I couldn't figure out why. Why wouldn't sociology students be required to take that? And my colleagues said, oh, well, we cover some of that in urban sociology. No, not enough. And I had a course that I taught for criminal justice called Piracy, an Examination of Maritime Crime. My favorite course of all, and the one that really got me hired, was a dance class that I taught called Dance of the African Diaspora, where we learned all those old tradition dances. I taught folks how to do the mashed potatoes, how to do the funky butt, how to do the old horse. I brought in people who could teach them how to Philly bop, as it's called here in Philadelphia, but it's done everywhere. And I say that this is the American national dance, and the slop is the African American national dance.
I dig it. So one thing that I've come to notice when we're speaking of blues people, blues tradition, land, memory, and even our belief systems, right? It's subtly mentioned, but not as important as I think it should be, and that's the dance aspect. Is there, when you speak of praise dances and these things, is dance and hoodoo in our cultural praise? Could you walk us through that?
Oh yeah. One of the things I wanted to do, what also led me to write this book was my reading about the ring shout, this thing called the ring shout, which is that counterclockwise sacred circle in which people experience spirit possession. We call it catching the Holy Ghost when you're in
Pentecost.
church. And I just began to ask some questions about this ring shot. I'd seen it written about all over the place. Lots of people have written about it. And there was one piece I read, I think it was by Alexander Payne. And after emancipation, these proselytizers in the AME church go into the Deep South to save people, to convert them to Christianity. And I noticed that in one of the pieces I read, a young minister said that people would not be saved. They wouldn't accept Jesus if you wouldn't allow them to do the ring shout. And he says, you know, oh, you got to have a ring over yonder, another ring over yonder, ring back there, or sinners won't get saved. So I began to, excuse me, I began to think about that. And I thought, well, my goodness, if these converts wanted to bring the ring shout into their Christian conversion experience, what were they bringing it out of? They had to be bringing it out of something. So what were they bringing it out of? What was the previous context for this thing? And then I just began to ask a series of questions that a 6-year-old child would ask, like, well, mommy, if they were bringing it into the Christian conversion, what was it coming from? Where did it come from, mommy? And it dawned on me that it only could have come from one place, and that was a religious context that we are not acknowledging. And what could that have possibly have been? There's only one thing it could possibly have been, and that's hoodoo. Hoodoo had to have been at one point in our history, no matter how short that might have been. It had to have been a full-fledged religion for us, in the same way that Lukumi is for the Cubans, Vodun is for the Haitians, and all of those have their sacred dance, and those sacred dances are counterclockwise. The ring shout is counterclockwise. That's when the Spirit gave it to me. It had to have been the sacred dance of the old hoodoo religion, and that's how it's connected.
I just love how you break these things down. Well, so you made a very clear distinction between the Cuban, the Haitian. So are you saying hoodoo is Black American Southern?
Oh, yes, very much so. Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed. And it was short-lived, but it was a full-fledged religion for us nevertheless, complete with initiation rituals, And when you go back, I think the woman is Margaret Creel Washington. She has a section in her one of her books, and I don't remember exactly which one this is, but she literally describes the seeking ritual where the enslaved person, was taken out into the woods by the community of believers, and they had to go to certain stations in the woods and do certain things. Well, that sounds very much like the initiation I went through when I received Orisha.
Mm,
We had to go to the people put Ogun in my head, and we had to go certain places that imitated and reenacted the Ogun ritual for the warriors coming in from battle. So what
mm-hmm,
do they want to do? They want to go drinking. They want to go whoring. They want to go gambling. They want to carouse and cut up. They're on rest and recuperation. And so I had to literally be taken to a bar. My godfather said to me, "You got any reefer with you?" I said, "Well, no, I don't have any reefer with me. I'd known I should have brought some." He said, "Well, you got to smoke something." So he handed me a cigar. Somebody handed me a cigarette. And I said, "But I don't smoke tobacco." And they said, "But you got to puff on it for the ritual." And so I puffed on the cigarette and I puffed on it. We looked for an after hours joint down there in Live Oak, Florida. But instead, he took me to just a regular black bar because it was just too much of a headache to try to find one that night. And so I had to circle the marketplace 9 times for Oya and just a series of reenactments. This very thing was done by slaves out in the woods early on. I
mm,
said before 1750 even, very early on. And Margaret Creel Washington documents this thing. Why no
mm,
one ever made the connection is beyond me, because the connection was very clear to me when I read it.
mm-hmm. So, well, let's talk about that because one of the things that I received was your calling to write the book was
Yeah.
based on putting it in the proper putting our cultural practice in the proper context. So now, one of the things that I've come across is that at one time it was equivalent to arson, rape, and murder to practice this, right? And that there were African uh, and assimilated Negroes that were, I guess, AME pastors that were trying to uh, rid the Black Southern community of this practice. Is this the truth?
Well, I would say that it's true for some of them, but not true for all of them. Um, I've been told that Martin Luther King carried a mojo bag. There's
Mm-hmm.
a root worker named Papa Say, who was born and raised in New Orleans, and he was a musician, and he knew the musician who was down in the courtyard playing his saxophone. He says when Martin was shot on that balcony, and he says right before he was shot, he turns around and he says, "Oh, I got to go back in there. I left my bag." Everybody says that he was talking about his briefcase, but this man says he was talking about his mojo bag.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, I don't know, but Papa Say says he was talking about his mojo bag. And of course, Martin was steeped in Black culture. He
Right.
understood our people. And I was told, I don't know if this is true, that he won the Golden Gloves, but I do know that he was a pool shark. You do not let Martin break the balls because you will not get a shot. I mean, that's what everybody, and when I worked for Delta Ministry in the 60s, and that's what everybody said about him. Um, and he would come into town and he would go into this pool hall that was right next door to the Delta Ministry office. And I never saw him shoot pool, but other people saw him shoot pool and they said, "Don't let him break the balls."
Mm.
So he was steeped in the traditions of our people. Um, I read an account where a reverend who wanted to get people to give up their hoodoo bags and give up their mojo bags came into church and he had a huge piece of coal that he put in a giant mojo bag. And when he asked people to give up their jacks, as they were also called, and they wouldn't do it, he reached under the lectern and pulled out this big old mojo bag and slapped it up on top of the lectern. And he said, I got the granddaddy mojo, and he wants you to bring all your little baby mojos up here and put it in front of him."
Mm.
And that's when people began to come up and drop their mojo bags in front of the pulpit. I can't remember
Wow.
where I read that story, but it's probably in the bibliography of the book.
So, well, what about the it becoming equivalent to high level crimes practicing?
Well, many of the root workers were midwives, and the
Mm-hmm.
midwives were important in maintaining hoodoo tradition because they're the people who could get the umbilical cords and the calls to work certain types of roots. When the American medical establishments attack and get rid of the black midwives, it literally severs that connection from hoodoo. So the outside medical profession probably did at least as much damage as some of the non believers who were trying to get people to give up that old mess.
Well, okay, I got, so you know what that reminds me of? Uh the contradiction of fair hope. The idea, because they had midwives, they had a benevolence fund, and the idea of integration and the changing of systems. Okay, all right. So I want, before, I should have asked you this earlier on, but this time now, because I'm assuming people know and they may not know. The black belt hoodoo, and then modern hoodoo. Could you break this concept down for us, please?
Well, I think in the book I call them marketeered hoodoo, which is
Yeah.
that commercialized
Ha
hoodoo
ha.
taken up by primarily outsiders, largely outsiders, who are, once we leave the Black Belt South, we lose a we lose some of the connection. We don't lose all of the connection, but we lose some of the connection because we don't have the harvest grounds. We're on cement and asphalt and concrete, and
Right.
it's not as easy to access the plants and animals that were used in hoodoo tradition. There's certain fish you can't get anymore. Um, there's a fish, I have a picture of it on my here on the computer, of a fish that literally has human teeth in its mouth. When you open its mouth, it looks just like human teeth, and it's
Really.
nasty as hell. And that fish was used to do root work, but it only you can only catch this fish in the deep south. You can't get it in the waters of the north. Um,
Right.
and there are other things. The harvest grounds are not there anymore. So we're almost forced to start buying these things from supply houses and people who are exploiting us.
Right.
Never really practice the tradition, don't really understand it. And of course, with our disconnection from it, we've lost something as well. So we turn to these marketeers and they do a booming business, a
Yeah.
booming business. Some of them even convince the preachers to let them set up right outside of their churches. So you
Mm,
have white outsiders, many of whom were Jewish. A large percentage of them were German Jews. And
really.
yes, they turn to hoodoo because they cannot get into mainstream life as chemists. The Christians and the white people will not hire them because they're Jews. So how do they support themselves? They support themselves by exploiting our community and our traditions.
Mm,
There was a person who was a store here in Philadelphia that they've closed some years ago now, and they literally had the hoodoo lab right over the top of the store, and they would take flour and white baby powder and dye it blue and sell it to people as some sort of sacred powders. It was nothing
mm.
more than baby powder and flour dyed blue, and they
Wow.
would employ their children and grandchildren during the summer. It gave them summer jobs. And I went past there one day, and there were all these little old black ladies sitting outside waiting for this white woman to give them a reading.
What?
Yeah, and it literally made my blood boil to see how disconnected we actually become from the tradition. Yeah.
Well, so there's a couple of things that you said there that I wanted to unpack, but disconnection is a good general space to discuss, right? Because I'm really into this idea of, well, not the idea, but I'm looking into the disenfranchisement, the separation of us from the land, which is one your opening statement,
Oh,
right?
yeah. Yeah.
So this idea of the migration and kind of removing uh the plantation complex, removing folk from their tribal land and medicinal land, uh how how is that, or better yet, let me ask a more solution-based question. There's a lot of us that have moved to the concrete, to the urban areas. Is there a way to reconnect to the original root of our tradition?
Well, it depends on how far back you want to go. There are people around who are still trying to practice the old tradition. Um, there was a guy in North Carolina at one time who wrapped a mojo bag called the Four Corners of the Earth.
Mm,
I was just fascinated with. I lost touch with him, but he was in Virginia for some time, and he was fairly young. Today, he'd probably be in his, I'm going to say, late 50s, early 60s. And when I interviewed Dr. Buzzard down on St. Helena Island, um, this is
wow,
this is Dr. Buzzard's great grandson, by the way. His grandmother was Dr. Buzzard's daughter. Yeah,
wow.
Brother Gregory, and he was
You
still
come out of the line of Charlotte Fort and Gremke.
yeah, yeah,
Wow.
yeah. And I'm assuming that he has not passed away. He's probably in his late 60s, maybe early 70s at the most, because he's younger than I am. And the last time I was there, I had a root worker with me named Miss Mary. And Miss Mary was from Sheffield, Alabama. And when I went down, the first time I went down to interview her, she had one of her diggers. She had guys that would go around and dig up roots for her. Or if they spotted something they know she could use, they'd dig it up and bring it to her. One of her diggers presented me with a huge poke root as a gift.
Mm.
Yeah. So I thanked him and brought it on home with me. It was gigantic. Um, but I found that the best root workers were still in the church. Yeah, 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 yeah. Yeah,
Mm.
and I couldn't find a root worker that I could interview until I came across Brother Gregory and Miss Mary, and they kind of surfaced for me. But to find the other root workers, which I couldn't do, I was asking the wrong question. I was asking the question that everybody else is asking. You know, how do I find a root worker? What can I? That's not the question to ask. The question to ask in the church is this: you say, "I've got a friend or I've got a relative that somebody done put something on."
Mm.
The minute you say that, the ears will perk up and say, I'm looking for somebody that could take these roots up off of this person. You know
Mm.
anybody that could take the roots off of somebody? That's when they start to say, well, I can take the roots off of somebody.
Mm.
There's your hoodoo worker. There's your hoodoo worker.
So let me ask you this question, because that conversation sounds like come up to the altar and get this spirit prayed off you.
That's right. Only they will pray and do other things as well. I saw an interview maybe 20 years ago, 25 years ago on the Today Show, I think it was. And they were interviewing a doctor who was working down in coastal South Carolina, around Mount Pleasant, around that area, Allendale. And he said that he was having a difficult time getting people to take their medication. So what he did was this: he learned something about the traditions of the people in the area, and he learned that they really, really believed in roots and root work. So what he did was he ritualized his prescriptions. Whenever he gave somebody a bottle of medicine, he said, now listen, you can't just take this. This is what you have to do. You got to get your Bible out. You got any white candles? If they don't have any white candles, he'd give them a white candle. He said, now listen, this is what you got to do. You got to say the Lord's Prayer. Then you got to read the first half of the 23rd Psalms and light this candle. Then
Mm.
you got to walk around in a circle 3 times. Then you take your medicine, but don't take it before then. And he got 100% compliance
Mm.
because he went into the tradition of the people. He acknowledged their traditions.
Right.
He didn't
Right.
attempt to invalidate them.
Right.
And he got 100% compliance.
Makes sense. Makes sense. What I'm hearing from you is the blues, agriculture, and land is, and I guess folk belief. This is the for lack of better recipe for hoodoo.
Yeah, and I try to connect what we think of as the sacred and the secular.
Right,
And
please.
at one point in the book, when that chapter called The Search for High John the Conqueror, I have a High John story. I have a Nigger John story, as they were called.
Mm.
And
Okay.
I have Mr. John's bawdy tale. And when I was in Florida, is when I really was able to connect what I had grown up with a wider world. Mr. John always told, and that was his name was Mr. Jim. We called him, his name was Jim Peterson, James Peterson. And Mr. Jim always told, quote, Nigger John jokes. And
Mm.
he told this joke one time. And of course, in the Nigger John jokes, Nigger John, of course, that term nigger is used to denigrate us
Right.
when it's used by outsiders. But these Nigger John jokes, John always outsmarts the smarter white man. He always finds a way to outsmart him. And it dawned on me that these Nigger John jokes were a backwater tributary of the High John the Conqueror stories. They were a pure secularization of them. And I
Really.
had Mr. Jim's bawdy tale in that High John the Conqueror chapter. I also had a chance to go down to the University of Maryland. I called a anthropology professor down there one time, and I began to talk to him about his work I was doing. And he invited me down to the University of Maryland, College Park. And I went down and I spent a couple of days with them. And so after I was in there for a few hours, they literally pulled out an entire conjurer's cache. They had been doing digs, archaeological digs on old plantations, and
Mm.
dug up, literally, under the big house, a conjurer's complete cache. But they didn't understand exactly what they had. So they said, will you do something for us? They said, we want you to take a look at something. And when they opened that door, they had literally laid that conjurer's cache out in the exact way they had found it, with certain things facing east, certain things at the bottom. And he said, what is this? I recognized it instantly. That's the old walking board. That's the old divination that the conjurers used to use. It was hung on a string and swung from the finger. After I got initiated, I realized the puele chain
Mm.
is handled exactly that way.
Wow.
Exactly that way. And I literally immediately saw the connection. And I saw all kinds of things on that table that they didn't know anything about, but that were familiar to me and that I could connect with the Yoruba tradition I had been initiated into.
Mm. Oh man, this is. I want to go back to High John the Conqueror, and I know Muddy Water mentions him in a couple of songs as well, right?
Yeah.
But before, when we were just talking on the phone, you mentioned a humongous find of who or what entity or the actual reality of High John the Conqueror, I guess, juxtapose what people think they know. Care to talk to us about that?
Yeah. When I started doing research on this root, I discovered that it is native, its native home, and the only place on God's earth where it grows naturally is only one place, and that is Jalapa, Mexico. It
Mm.
gets its name, jalap root, from that. And I said, my God, how does a root that only grows in Jalapa, Mexico, become so important to Black folks in Virginia or Cleveland for that matter, or Detroit? How the hell does that happen? And that's when I got Walter Johnson's book, Soul by Soul, Life Inside. I happen to have a copy here with me. Soul by Soul, Life Inside the Antebellum Slave Market. And as I began to read this and trace out his footnotes, it dawned on me that New Orleans was once owned by the French, then it was owned by the Spanish, then it's owned by the French again, and then the United States gets it. Well,
Mm.
while it is owned by the Spaniards changed their center of commerce from Seville, Spain to New Orleans, Louisiana. And they
Mhm.
started trading slaves into the slave pens of New Orleans from all over the Spanish Empire. And they trade quite a few slaves out of Jalapa, Mexico, into New Orleans slave pens. And the slave boy stewards are the ones that spread it all around the slave pens. And as people are sold out of the slave pens into all over the Black Belt South, and that's how it spreads. So I
Wow.
had to prove that there were slaves in that slave pen whose birthplace and whose early life had been Jalapa, Mexico. That's when I turned to the work of Gwendolyn Midlow Hall. She was the wife of the famous communist agitator, Harry Haywood.
Mm,
She had just produced a 150,000 point database on New Orleans ancestry. So I
mm,
got her database, I borrowed it from our library. And when I put it in my computer, I couldn't get it to work. So I called a friend of mine that had Gwen's phone number. And I called her. And I said, listen, I got this problem. I'm trying to find slaves in the New Orleans slave pens that were born in Jalapa, Mexico. And since you did this work on ancestry, were there any? And she said, go to your computer. And I sat down and she told me what to punch in. And when I punched it in and hit return, up on the screen popped the name of 12 slaves that had been sold into the slave pens of New Orleans
mm,
out of Jalapa, Mexico. The ancestors gave this thing to me. I didn't write it. The ancestors, I give praise to the ancestors. I didn't write this book. Something wrote it through me. I wrote
mm,
my first book, Jookin. I didn't write Mojo Workin. I
mm,
give honor to the spirits that put that book in me because I'll go back and I'll read and I'll say, damn, did I really write this?
mm.
I can't believe I wrote it myself.
How this is for the audience because this question, because I'm a firm believer as a blues person and a blues performer, blues is sacred,
Oh,
secular,
yeah.
but it's very sacred, right? Mojo Working to me is blues sacred. Could you talk or explain to us the circle of sacred, blues, and hoodoo?
Well, they're very connected, not only because there are lots of blues songs that mention hoodoo, but I think that the blues is a secularized spiritual.
Mm,
It has the same energy, it has the same commitment. It's able to raise the same kind of spiritual feeling. You can get lost in it the same way that you get lost in the spirit. I've seen
mhm,
people in dance contests, black folks in dance contests, and this has happened to me because I was a little champion dancer. I used to win all the dance contests in my block. You get so engrossed in the movement that you literally lose part of your consciousness and you start dancing and your face will freeze. And I call this it's a form of masking.
mm,
I call it awareness mask. It's
mhm,
a sacred process that's been secularized.
mm,
This piece, blues people, I use that in literally all of my classes. My African American culture class. I have a class called the sociology of the blues. I have one called the sociology of jazz. I created those for records, and we read blues people in each
mm,
one of those.
mhm,
Yeah,
mhm,
there's a strong connection. The Jook House is a secularized church.
mhm.
You get the same kind of feeling, this lost in the spirit, only you're not praising God in the same way that you would in the church. The dance movements are certainly the same. The music is the same music. There was a sanctified church that I didn't attend that was right across the street from me as I grew up. And there was a girl that would be in there named Vivian Boozer. And I mean, she could work that tambourine to death. But we would, as little kids, we would be outside doing all the secular dances right in front of the church, right in front of the church door. And they'd chase us away because we were kind of making fun of them. And they'd fall under the Holy Spirit. And some of them would break out into mashed potatoes. And then we started doing the mashed potatoes outside of the church. So, I mean, where do you draw that line? And for Africans, there is no such thing as secular. For the
Mm,
traditional African, everything is sacred. You hear people saying, well, render unto Caesar that which is Caesar and render unto God that. To hell with that. Caesar don't even belong to Caesar. Caesar belongs to God. Everything is sacred for the African. There's no such thing as a secular world.
I mean, you took it really there. So now, that would that mean that's a concept that is not of the blues people?
Yeah, this thing comes from somewhere else.
I mean, this is just great. It is. I want to ask about you just got me so excited I forgot my question. um but we were it was the you know what? Okay, we'll come back to that. We'll come back to that. We'll definitely come back to that. We'll come back to that. Let me go to my notes because
There's no clear distinction today, even. And it's clearer today than it's ever been, but it's still fuzzy. I mean, just look at the life of somebody like, say, Sam Cooke or Aretha Franklin. How many of our vocalists did not come out of the church?
So that right there, because up until possibly the last 10 to 20 years, all of our vocalists, all of our musicians come out of the black church. And then all of a sudden, it didn't happen. So you know what? That's what I wanted to ask you about. The Pentecostal church as a hoodoo experience. And then I can't think of the preacher's name who actually like had a church that I think this was in 60s maybe, where he had a Pentecostal church, but they were very open about practicing hoodoo.
I'm not sure who that is, but I will tell you this: if any of you remember Reverend Ike,
yeah, absolutely.
Reverend Ike sold prayer cloths.
That
prayer cloth was nothing more than a modified mojo bag.
Really?
Think about it.
Well, yeah, my grandmama had them.
Served the same function as a mojo bag. They were red, many of them. Yeah. And they served the same function, protection, drawing wealth. When my mother died and I went to clean out her house, I found more bottles of money drawing oil.
Yeah.
All over the place. Money drawing oil, jinx removing powder, everywhere.
That's what I wanted to ask you. Your work in Mississippi as a young lady, which I guess starts your civil rights activism. Is it and so civil rights, Mississippi, the blues and hoodoo. Do you kind of come to this epiphany that all these things are connected to you at that time?
Not at that time.
Okay.
It happens later.
Okay.
I had the privilege of seeing Howlin' Wolf perform at the local Black VF&W club in Greenville in 1968. Wow. Yeah. I didn't realize how useful and how important that was at the time. I was just in there having a good time with everybody else. But now I'm so grateful for that experience. Also, I noticed that in this film, Sinners, the main character, the Smokestack Twins, he has a mojo bag. And he has it around his neck and it's hidden. But I say that if it were back in the 30s, that mojo bag probably would not have been around his neck. That mojo bag would have been where my daddy kept his. And that was hung around his waist, hanging between his legs. And when I read that book, God, Dr. Buzzard, and the Bolito Man, and I might have a copy here close to me somewhere here with these various books I've got piled up everywhere. There's an account where she talks about her grandfather carrying a mojo bag his entire life, and he always wore it tied around his waist and let it hang between his legs, just like my daddy told me he did. Yeah.
So those who don't know what not only you're talking about, but they have a misconception because they're enthusiasts and they're just repeating what they hear in the song. There's reasons why these blues musicians who were actually performing in the 30s were saying what they were saying and why they was using the mojo. And this goes back to when earlier on you were explaining to us it was whether a woman didn't want her man to perform with another woman, or
yeah, I mean, there was a recipe for everything, literally all of your problems. And the thing that's so wonderful about the hoodoo tradition and about the mojo bag, and we know this today as a result of the work of many, many important psychologists, Eric Fromm, Sigmund Freud, so many of them have written about the power of suggestion to visualize a reality.
Mm-hmm.
It's almost a subconscious form of hypnosis where the person is wrapping the mojo bag and talking to you about what it's going to do for you. When I went to see Brother Gregory, I had him wrap one for me and for my daughter. And I noticed that as he turned that thread around that mojo bag, he wrapped 16 times in all four directions. And the old hoodoo men will tell you that 4 by 4 is the sacred number.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and he wrapped it 16 times. When I had the first hand of Ifa put on my wrist, when my godfather tied this thing, that knot right there, he put it in there 16 times. He tied 16 knots. And with every tie of the knot, he said one of the Odus of Ifa. When Brother Gregory wrapped that mojo bag for me, he turned it 16 times, and every time he said a Bible verse into it. He didn't have the Odus of Ifa to say. He said what he had. He put a Bible verse in it. He put an Odu of Ifa in it. They were doing the same exact thing under different circumstances in a different context for people who were now different. But he was still connected to the tradition.
Now different meaning Black American?
Yes. Those of us on this side of the Atlantic, the new African.
So that goes back. So the Black folk that are considered indigenous to the America are actually an extension, is what you're saying.
Yeah. That's why I tell people all the time. They say, well, Katrina, why don't you change your name to an African name? I ain't got to change my name to an African name to be an African. The minute you're born out of a Black woman's body, you are already an African. Our experience is as much of what we have lived is as much of the African experience as any other African experience. We are part of the African experience. You already an African. You ain't got to proclaim yourself to be no African. You already that. This is part of the African experience. Enslavement is part of the African experience. What comes out of that is part of the African experience.
So where how does the practice, the culture of hoodoo cultivate in the South, and what does Cuba have to do with it?
Let me just say one quick thing about dance that I
Yes,
hope
ma'am.
will illuminate some of this. I've danced all my life, and as I said, as a kid, I won lots of dance contests and neighborhood dance contests. In 1973, I had the opportunity to go to the University of Nairobi, Kenya, and I went with the American Institute for Foreign Studies, and I was the only African American in my group. There were some other Black folks that went, but they were from the Bahamas and they came with a different group. Well, one of the classes I took when I was there was an African dance class. So everybody in the dance class was white except me. Well, the people in East Africa, when they see somebody that looks like me, they think Arab or maybe somebody from the Seychelles. They knew I wasn't white, but they weren't exactly sure what was going on until I started to dance. The minute I started to go across the floor to the drum, I noticed the lead dancers and many of the drummers started pointing at me and looking at each other like, huh, look at her dance. She danced just like us. Look. So after the class was over, the lead dancer came up to me and she said, "How is it that you seem to know our dances even before we teach them to you?"
Mm-hmm.
And I said, "Well, it's a long story. You want to hear this?" And they said, "Yeah, yeah." And I said, "Well, I have ancestors from the other side of the continent." That's when the lead drummer yelled, "I told you she had the ancestors in her."
Mm.
The dance immediately connected me to any African people I have ever been around, whether they were in Cuba, in Kenya, or in London. The minute I start to move, they say, "Oh, uh-oh, she one of us. She got the ancestors in us."
Mm.
Yeah, that experience kind of blew me away too.
I can imagine.
I didn't expect that kind of response. I was just dancing like I always dance, you know. They said, "I told you." They had been taking bets. And he said, "I told you she had the ancestors in her."
What they were taking bets? Is it now? That's American. So
One of them said, "No, no, 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 no. She's an Arab. No, no, no." Someone said, she got the ancestors in her. She wouldn't be able to dance like that."
mm, mm,
And then
mm,
when
mm.
I said I had ancestors from the other side of the continent, he said, "I told you she had the ancestors in her."
So being you're a first person personal narrative of this entire blues people story. How did that position you in the space with a lot of fourth, fifth, sixth hand folks?
Well, I'm not exactly sure, but as I began to read various works on hoodoo, I would just see so much that was different from what I knew as hoodoo. Um, And I said, "This isn't the hoodoo I love, but this isn't what I learned. This isn't what I saw people doing and what I heard people talking about. And this isn't that." And it just kind of like baffled me at first. And that's when I began to kind of open this thing up and began to write about it. And that's when it happened. That's when when I wrote that article, Dancing to Rebalance the Universe, I was sitting at a typewriter. This is how long ago it was. I didn't have a computer. I was at an old IBM Selectric typewriter. And I was just typing. And I got up to turn around to leave the room. And as God is my witness, something reached and put its hand on my left shoulder. I can even feel it there now. And it said, "Don't turn around. I'm going to tell you what to say." And then it just downloaded. That article just downloaded. And when I got through typing it, I was exhausted, as if something had been taken out of me. That's when I started to say, "Oh, like, what the hell is going on? This is
Mm-hmm.
stuff." Like, ooh, I wasn't even sure. It was like I was sort of quasi frightened. Like, am I losing my mind or what? What's going on here? And my best work has happened that way. It's just downloaded. I don't know how else to explain it.
What was the response from, I guess, the Western institutions?
Well, some of the dance researchers were just kind of astonished and astounded. And one of them, in fact, Judith Lynn Hanna, the famous anthropologist who was one of the first social scientists to even write about dance, she once said to me, she said, "Katrina, you're a much better informant." Yeah. So
Right.
okay. That's when I kind of started to try to listen to myself and listen to this other thing that was, I don't know how to explain it, but this other thing was going on. Because I'd go back and read something after I wrote it, and did I really write this?
Mm,
Because if I sit down and try to write, I can't do it. Something
mm.
has to download or it's almost at one point I said, "Well, damn, is Zora's spirit up in here? What the hell's going on?" I don't know how to explain it, but that's what took me so long to write this book. I couldn't write it. I had to just wait and then it would happen.
Do you have a connection to Zora because she worked in this space as well?
I don't have any idea if I have any kind of connection. I've read her work, and in fact, her work really inspired me with that first book. And that's why have the title Jookin, because she calls it the jook, which is how our people pronounce it. We never called it a juke, but the juke box gets its name from the juke house.
Not
Yeah,
the other way around.
yeah. I interviewed the first black jukebox owners in America. Um,
Mm,
and they said that when they were getting ready to try to buy their first jukebox, which they said people used to call a juice box, just like the
mm,
electric guitar, because you used to plug it into the juice, the electricity, that no white company would sell it to them because they were black. So they had to
mm.
go up through North Tonawanda, New York, and cross into the Canadian territory. They had to go over into Canada before anyone would sell them a jukebox.
Wow.
Yeah. And they started putting them in the juke houses and the after hours joints, in the honky tonks. And they would cut a deal with the owner that they would take 10% of the profit and the owner could keep the 90%. And that's how they got people to accept them.
Mm.
Yeah, I have the interviews, and I mentioned the names in Jookin. In fact, I can remember one of them, Buddy Carroll, just sitting down talking to him about it. He told a
Well,
hell of a story.
you,
I also interviewed BB King for
really?
yes, and I missed him the first time, but the second time he came back to Ithaca, New York, I caught him and I
Mm.
interviewed him for Jookin. Yeah, he was so gracious, and oh, he was just wonderful. He was absolutely wonderful, and he invited me to his house in Colorado, gave me his address, and said, come on out and visit me. We'll have a great time.
So, do you still listen to the blues?
Oh yes, oh yes, I love Lil Walter. I mean, I love them all. I love them all. I even have an album called The Copulating Blues, which is a connection of dirty blues songs, so-called dirty blues songs. And let me tell you, they put Lil Kim to shame. Okay. And the way I found out about this was a guy at Cornell had the album, and I looked at the back of the album, and there was a guy who had written the liner notes. And I saw that he was a sociologist at Newport's, the State University at Newport's. So I called him up, and he was black.
Mm.
Not only was he black, he was Stephen Fetchit's brother-in-law.
Wow.
Yeah. And I asked him, can I come up and just talk to you and interview you and so I drove from Ithaca up to Newport's and he was living in Howard Koch's summer house. Howard
Wow.
Koch is the man that gave us the famous film Casablanca.
Wow.
Yeah. He was living in Howard Koch's house and his daughter was the ballet mistress of the Ailey Company at the time. His name was
Wow.
Howard Johnson and he used to work at the Cotton Club and where he was called Stretch Johnson. And boy, did he give up the goods. And he took me, and that's how I met Sandman Sims, who I interviewed for the book. That's how I met the old Hoofers. That's how I met Honey Coles. And
Wow.
I talked to Honey Coles one day, and I asked him, I said, did you ever see Snake Hips perform? He said, yeah, every day. Ate lunch with Snake Hips. I knew Snake Hips well. And I said, show me exactly what Snake Hips did. Show me the old Snake Hips. And when he began to do it, I joined him. Yeah, because I could do it. We didn't call it the Snake Hips. We called it popping your hips.
Mm.
A popping and locking that's done with the hip sockets instead of the shoulders and the upper body.
Right.
He said, well, you can already do it. I said, I had no idea that popping your hips was the old Snake Hips. So when I see people on the stage claiming they're doing the Snake Hips, I know if they're really doing it.
Right. Wow. There's so many. We're just touching the surface, good folks. I'm going to have to make a series of interviews with you because there's just so many directions of what I like to call Black Southern culture or blues ecology that
That's a great term.
but that's what it is, and there's just so many. You kind of cover all you cover the gambits. So we can't cover it all in one show. So we have to get you back on here.
Oh, I'd love to come back on. And thank you so much.
No, it was a pleasure. Is there another story you want to leave us with?
Well, I have a lot of those tales. Um, one of my favorite is the story that my daddy told me his whole life about how he got out of jail with hoodoo and how
Mm,
he tied this mojo bag around his waist and he was told to take a little piece of the root and chew it. And everywhere he went, he said to spit. So he was just spitting in his jail cell. He even spit in the courtroom. Well, I didn't know that he was using galanga root, as it's called, what the old folks call chewing John. He was chewing the root. And if you cannot chew the root for yourself, you can get somebody to chew the root for you. And that's what Dr. Buzzard did in South Carolina. He would put on these dark purple shades and he'd show up in the courtroom for a client and he'd be sitting in the back just chewing and spitting on behalf of
mm,
that client.
mm,
He was
mm.
chewing the root. So, around my house, we use all kinds of old expressions like somebody gets into trouble, we'll say, they're going to get somebody to chew the root for that.
Mm, mm,
Or if it's hot, we'll say, it's hot as a coke oven in here. Or if you start to perspire really heavily, we'll say, damn, I'm sweating like Ellen and Jack. And John Henry was a Jack. I won't tell you Mr. Jim's body tale because it's really, really what people consider pretty dirty, but it's in the book. And I say that these nigga John jokes and these nigga John tales were a backwater tributary, I call them, of the old High John the Conqueror myth.
mm, mhm,
And I think
mhm,
I can prove it.
mm,
And I think I do in the book. Um, when I began to ask that question about hoodoo, what was it connected to? I thought about the work of Sterling Stuckey, in which he says that the ring shout was responsible for the inter-ethnic assimilation of the Africans with each other, because that ring was familiar to all of them. And no matter where you came from, no matter what language you spoke, when you got off the boat and you saw that counterclockwise circle, it was familiar to you, so you could join in, even though you might not have been able to talk to the folks. But by the way, the average African captive being brought here spoke a minimum of 5 languages. That's what
mhm,
all the slave manuscripts that I ever went through said. I went through some of the manifests of slave ships. I went through the diary of Alexander Falconbridge, that famous slave ship surgeon. And they say the Africans could speak a minimum of 5 languages. When I was in East Africa, I met a young boy who talked to me in English and in Spanish. He talked to a white girl I was with in Italian. He talked to another one in German. He could speak 3 dialects of his mother tongue, 2 of the contiguous languages, and 5 other languages.
mm.
And he couldn't read, and he was 8 years old.
That's just that's deep.
And we talk about how inarticulate we are today. We
Right.
spoke a minimum of 5 languages when we got off that boat.
Mm, mm,
And this
mm,
makes me question the myth of the slave master mixing the populations on board the slave ships so they couldn't talk to each other. I think we have
mhm.
to question that.
Well, yeah, there's a lot of things we should question. I agree. I agree. And we can save that one also for another episode. Dr. Hazard, you're just a gem. Thank you so
Thank
much.
you so much. That humbles me.
And y'all know what to do. Check that book out, both of them. And where could the good people find you?
Um, you mean find the books?
Would you find the book, social media, website?
Well, I do have a Facebook page under Katrina Hazzard, and
There,
I do check it. There are 2 of them. I check them both. I did the second one by mistake because I didn't think the first one took, and I was kind of new to that at the time. But I do check them both. Um, or they could call you and get my phone number if they really, really want to talk to me. I'll be glad to talk to anybody about the work.
there you have it, good folks. Uh, you know what to do. You come here to learn the blues. See you next time.
Thank you so much.